It was a cold winter night, and the midnight express was speeding through the snowy mountains. The train was packed with passengers, each with their own secrets. Among them was Detective Arthur Blake, a sharp-minded investigator known for solving the most puzzling cases. He was on his way to a conference in Vienna, but fate had other plans. As the train rattled on, the passengers settled into their compartments. There was Mrs. Eleanor Gray, a wealthy widow, Mr. James Carter, a businessman with a nervous demeanor, Miss Clara Finch, a young actress, and Dr. Samuel Harper, a retired surgeon. The atmosphere was tense, as if everyone was hiding something. At exactly midnight, the train came to a sudden halt. The lights flickered, and a scream echoed through the corridor. Detective Blake rushed out of his compartment to find Miss Clara Finch standing outside Mr. Carter's room, her face pale with fear. He's dead," she stammered. Detective Blake pushed open the door to find Mr. Carter slumped in his seat, a knife protruding from his chest. The room was in disarray, and a blood-stained handkerchief lay on the floor. The window was slightly open, letting in a cold breeze. The conductor, Mr. Thompson, arrived moments later. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice trembling. "There's been a murder," Detective Blake said calmly. "No one leaves this train until we find the killer." Passengers were gathered in the dining car, their faces filled with fear and suspicion. Detective Blake began his investigation by questioning each of them. Mrs. Eleanor Gray was the first to speak. "I was in my compartment all evening," she said. "I heard nothing unusual." Miss Clara Finch was next. "I was walking to the dining car when I saw Mr. Carter's door slightly open. I peeked inside and found him. Like that." Dr. Samuel Harper adjusted his glasses and said, "I was reading in my compartment. I didn't hear anything until the scream." Detective Blake noticed that Dr. Harper's hands were trembling slightly. "Did you know Mr. Carter?" he asked. The doctor hesitated. "We met briefly at the station." He seemed troubled. As the detective continued his investigation, he found a crumpled piece of paper in Mr. Carter's pocket. It was a note that read, "Meet me at midnight. We need to talk. A.G." Detective Blake turned to Mrs. Gray. "Is this your handwriting?" he asked, showing her the note. She gasped. "Yes, but I never wrote this." "Someone must have forged it." The detective then examined the blood-stained handkerchief. It had the initials S.H. embroidered on it. He turned to Dr. Harper. "Is this yours?" The doctor's face turned pale. "Yes, but I lost it earlier. I have no idea how it ended up here." The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but something didn't add up. Why would someone frame Mrs. Gray and Dr. Harper? And who had the motive to kill Mr. Carter? Detective Blake decided to search the train for more clues. In the luggage compartment, he found a suitcase filled with counterfeit money and a passport under a different name. It belonged to Mr. Carter. "It seems Mr. Carter was involved in some illegal activities," the detective muttered to himself. As he returned to the dining car, he noticed Miss Clara Finch nervously fidgeting with her necklace. "Miss Finch, is there something you'd like to share?" he asked. She hesitated, then burst into tears. I knew Mr. Carter. He was blackmailing me. He had evidence of a mistake I made in my past, and he threatened to ruin my career if I didn't pay him." The detective nodded. "And did you pay him?" "Yes, but he kept demanding more. I couldn't take it anymore." Detective Blake turned to Mrs. Gray. "And you, Mrs. Gray? Did Mr. Carter have something on you as well?" She sighed. "Yes. He knew about financial indiscretion from my late husband's business. He threatened to expose me. The detective then addressed Dr. Harper. And you, doctor? What was your connection to Mr. Carter? The doctor looked down. He was blackmailing me too. I made a mistake during the surgery years ago, and he found out. He threatened to ruin my reputation. Detective Blake leaned back in his seat, piecing together the information. It seems Mr. Carter was a master manipulator, preying on people's secrets. But who among you had the motive to kill him? The passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Suddenly, the train lurched, and the lights went out. In the darkness, a loud crash was heard. When the lights came back on, Dr. Harper was lying on the floor, unconscious. Detective Blake rushed to his side. "Someone doesn't want us to solve this case," he said. He quickly searched the doctor's pockets and found a small vial of poison. It seems the killer tried to silence him. The detective then turned to Mrs. Gray and Miss Finch. "One of you is the killer. But which one?" Mrs. Gray stood up, her face filled with anger. "It wasn't me. I may have been blackmailed, but I would never resort to murder." Miss Finch, however, remained silent, her hands trembling. Detective Blake approached her. "Miss Finch, the truth will come out. It's better to confess now." She broke down in tears. I did it. I couldn't take it anymore. He was destroying my life. I thought if I killed him, I could be free." The detective nodded. "I understand your pain, but murder is never the answer." As the train arrived at the next station, the police were waiting to take Miss Finch into custody. Detective Blake watched as she was led away, a sense of sadness in his heart. The mystery of the Midnight Express was solved, but the scars it left behind would remain forever.